I was standing in the kitchen when the crying started again, and this time it didn't sound like noise. It sounded like fear. Small, shaky, half-swallowed sobs drifting down the hallway like someone was afraid to be heard. The lights above me buzzed softly, one of them flickering the way it always did, and for a moment I just stared at the counter, my hands flat against the cold surface, trying to convince myself this wasn't real, that this was just a moment, that someone else would step in, that any second now, I'd hear familiar footsteps, a voice calling out, laughter, movement, proof that I wasn't alone in this house. But nothing came. The clock on the wall ticked so loudly it felt like it was counting down something I couldn't stop. Every second pressed into my chest, heavy and unforgiving. I remember thinking how strange it was that a house could feel so full and so empty at the same time. Toys were scattered across the floor. Shoes by the door. Coats hanging where they'd been dropped in a hurry. All the signs of life were there, frozen in place, like a scene paused halfway through a movie. And yet, the people who were supposed to be here weren't. The crying got louder. I told myself to breathe. Just breathe. I wasn't panicking yet. Not fully. Panic felt too big, too dramatic for what I was still pretending this was. I walked slowly toward the hallway, every step hesitant, like the floor might give way beneath me if I moved too fast. The carpet muffled my footsteps, and somehow that made everything worse. It felt sneaky. Wrong. Like I was moving through a space I didn't belong in. "Hey," I said softly, pushing the bedroom door open. My voice didn't sound like mine. It shook in places I didn't expect. "It's okay." But I wasn't sure who I was saying it to. A small face looked up at me, red and blotchy, eyes wide with confusion. That look. The one kids get when they know something isn't right, but don't have the words for it yet. Hit me harder than anything else. They weren't just crying because they were tired or hungry. They were crying because they sensed absence, because they felt the gap where adults should have been. And suddenly, I felt it too. I tucked them back into bed, moving on instinct, doing things I'd seen done 1,000 times but never expected to be responsible for. Blanket. Stuffed animal. Light left on just enough. I whispered reassurances I wasn't sure I believed, promising that everything was fine, that everyone would be back soon, that they were safe. Safe. The word echoed in my head as I closed the door and leaned against the wall, sliding down until I was sitting on the floor. That's when my hands started shaking. Not violently. Just enough to notice. Just enough to scare me. I pulled my phone out again, even though I already knew what it would show me. No missed calls. No new messages. The last text sat there like it had teeth. Casual. Short. Almost cheerful. Like this was normal. Like this was agreed upon. I read it again. And again. That was the moment something cracked inside me. Not loudly. Not all at once. But quietly. The way ice does before it breaks. The realization crept in slowly, unwelcome and undeniable. I hadn't just been left alone. I'd been left in charge. I hadn't been asked if I was okay with it. I hadn't been prepared. I hadn't been given a choice. And somehow, standing there in that silent hallway, it felt like the decision had been made long before I ever walked through that front door. The house felt bigger now, too big. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound sharper. The heater kicked on and I jumped. The refrigerator hummed and my heart raced. I kept expecting the door to open, keys jangling, someone calling out my name like this was all a misunderstanding. Like I'd laugh nervously and say, "You scared me," and everything would go back to normal. But the door stayed closed. I walked back into the kitchen and noticed things I hadn't before. The way the trash was empty, like it had been taken out early. The way the fridge was stocked with labeled containers. The way the calendar on the wall had a week circled, with nothing written inside it. It felt intentional, organized, planned. That scared me more than the silence. I sat at the table and put my head in my hands, staring at the wood grain beneath my fingers. I tried to think logically, tried to slow my thoughts. But they kept spiraling, jumping ahead to questions I wasn't ready to answer. How long were they really gone? What if something happened? What if I messed up? What if the kids woke up sick, or scared, or asking questions I couldn't answer? What if they asked where everyone went? The idea of that made my throat tighten. I realized then how alone I truly was, not just physically, but emotionally. There was no one to ask, no one to lean on, no adult voice to say, "You're doing fine." Just me, sitting in a borrowed house, responsible for lives that weren't mine, on a holiday that was supposed to mean togetherness. Christmas lights blinked softly in the corner of the room, cheerful and oblivious. I'd never hated something so pretty before. Another cry echoed down the hall, sharper this time, edged with panic. I stood up immediately, my body moving before my mind caught up. That's when I understood something terrifying. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't hoping. I was responding. I was already in it. And as I walked back toward that bedroom, heart pounding, a single thought cut through the fear. Clear and undeniable, they didn't forget me here. They left me here. And I was the one who had to survive the night. I didn't come home because I missed the place. I came home because she sounded different on the phone. Softer. Slower. Like someone who had finally realized they'd gone too far and didn't want to lose what was left. When she said my name, there was this pause before it, like she was choosing it carefully, and that alone made my chest tighten. She talked about Christmas the way people do when they're trying to rewrite the past, as if the right decorations and the right food could fix years of silence. She said it would mean everything to her if I came. She said the kids kept asking about me. She said it wasn't the same without me there. I told myself that mattered. I told myself that if someone reaches out like that, you answer. That being the bigger person meant showing up even when it hurt. I ignored the small voice in my head that reminded me how many times I'd been disappointed before. I packed my bags anyway, folding sweaters I hadn't worn in years, slipping old hopes between the layers like they wouldn't wrinkle. The drive home felt longer than it used to. Every mile marker brought back memories I wasn't sure I was ready to face. I kept rehearsing conversations in my head. What I'd say if things felt awkward. How I'd respond if old wounds came up. How I'd keep things light if I needed to. I imagined us sitting together, late at night, the house quiet, finally saying the things we'd avoided for too long. I imagined apologies. I imagined understanding. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same. Same faded paint. Same crooked step. Same porch light that took a second too long to turn on. It was like time had stopped there, waiting for me to come back and fill in the empty space. She was at the door before I even shut the car off, arms open, smile wide, calling my name like she'd been practicing it. The hug felt real. That's what confused me the most. She held on a little too long, like she was afraid I'd disappear if she let go. She smelled like the same perfume from my childhood, and for a moment, I was transported back to a version of myself that still believed in safety. She kept saying how good it was to see me, how proud she was, how this Christmas was going to be different. She said all the right things, hitting every soft spot I had without missing a single one. Inside, the house was warm. Overheated, almost. Christmas music played low in the background, the kind that sounds gentle but repetitive enough to get inside your head. Decorations were everywhere, garlands, lights, ornaments that hadn't been unpacked in years. It felt intentional, like a stage set for a performance. Like she wanted me to see the effort. The kids ran up to me, excited, loud, wrapping their arms around my legs and talking all at once. I laughed, genuinely, because their energy was contagious. In that moment, I thought maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe this really was about family. Maybe she just wanted everyone together again. She watched us from the doorway, smiling in that quiet way that makes you think you're doing something right. That first night, we ate dinner together like nothing had ever been broken. She cooked all my favorites. She asked questions about my life, work, friends, plans, and actually listened to the answers. When I talked, she nodded, made eye contact, reached across the table, and squeezed my hand at the right moments. It felt intimate, healing, like we were finally learning how to be in the same room again. I went to bed that night lighter than I'd felt in a long time. The next morning, she was already up, moving through the house with purpose. Coffee brewed. Breakfast set out. She asked if I could help get the kids ready. Just for a minute, while she finished something upstairs. It didn't feel like a request that mattered. Of course I said yes. That's what being helpful looks like. That's what being grateful looks like. It started like that. Small, harmless, easy to justify. Over the next couple of days, she kept talking about how much she needed this Christmas. How stressful the year had been. How she hadn't had a break in so long. She laughed it off, but there was always a tired edge beneath it. She'd sigh dramatically, rub her temples, say things like, "I don't know what I'd do without you here." And every time she said it, something warm and dangerous bloomed in my chest. I wanted to be needed. I wanted to be the reason things felt easier. She asked me to watch the kids while she ran errands, while she wrapped gifts, while she took phone calls in the other room. It was never framed as responsibility. It was framed as trust. Like I was being let back into the inner circle. Like I'd earned my place again. And I didn't notice how often she disappeared until I realized how rarely she stayed. The night before everything changed, she sat beside me on the couch, legs tucked under her, voice low. She talked about how important it was for the kids to have stability. How they needed someone calm, someone patient, someone who wouldn't panic. She said I had always been good in a crisis. Always dependable. Always strong. Those words settled on me like a weight I mistook for love. She went to bed early that night, saying she was exhausted. I stayed up, staring at the Christmas tree, watching the lights blink on and off, replaying her words in my head. I felt useful. Included. Chosen. I didn't see the trap because it didn't look like one. It looked like a second chance. And when I finally fell asleep, I did it believing I'd come home to be held, not handed something I never agreed to carry. At first, nothing felt wrong enough to question. That's the part that still messes with me when I think about it. How quietly it all shifted, how responsibility didn't arrive with an announcement or a warning, but slipped into my hands one small moment at a time. It felt like fog rolling in. You don't notice it until you realize you can't see where you started. It began with routines. Not requests, really, just assumptions. She'd say things like, "They're used to breakfast around 8, as she passed through the kitchen already halfway out the door. Or, "They'll need their jackets if you take them outside," without ever asking if I planned to. I'd nod automatically, my brain translating those statements into instructions without questioning why I was the one receiving them. I told myself it was temporary. Just helping. Just pitching in. That's what people do when they're staying with family over the holidays. You don't keep score. You don't draw lines. You just show up. But the lines were being drawn for me anyway. I started waking up earlier than everyone else. Not because I needed to, but because I'd learned the house didn't really wake up unless I did. The kids would pad into the kitchen still half asleep, hair sticking up, looking for direction. They'd ask me what was for breakfast before they asked anyone else. At first, I laughed it off. I didn't want to read too much into it. Kids latch onto whoever's there, whoever responds. And I was always there. She moved through the house differently now. Slower when she wanted sympathy. Faster when she wanted distance. She'd linger just long enough to hand something off. A responsibility disguised as a favor. Can you just keep an eye on them while I shower? Can you help with homework while I finish this? The phrasing was always gentle. Casual. Designed to make refusal feel rude. I noticed I was the one buckling seatbelts. The one reminding them to wash their hands. The one negotiating bedtime when energy ran too high. I started memorizing preferences. Who hated crusts, who needed the nightlight brighter, who cried if their socks didn't feel right. None of this was asked of me directly. It was just absorbed. There's a strange kind of pressure that comes with being seen as capable. People assume your strength is endless because you've never shown them where it stops. I had been strong my whole life. Reliable. The one who didn't complain. And she knew that. She knew exactly which part of me to lean on. Sometimes she'd praise me in front of others. I don't know what I'd do without them, she'd say, smiling like it was a joke. Everyone would nod approvingly. I'd feel a rush of pride mixed with something colder. A sense of being watched, evaluated. Like I was passing a test I didn't know I was taking. And every time I thought about stepping back, something stopped me. Guilt, habit, hope. I kept thinking if I just stayed helpful, if I just proved I could be trusted, maybe this time things would stay good. Maybe this time I wouldn't be pushed aside again. I didn't realize I was being positioned, not as family, but as infrastructure. Something useful, dependable, invisible. The shift became more obvious in the quiet moments. She stopped checking in. Stopped asking how I was settling in. Conversations turned logistical. Who needed what? What time things happened, where things were kept. She'd talk at me instead of with me, already walking away before I could respond. And still, I said nothing. Because confronting it would mean admitting something was wrong. And if something was wrong, then coming home hadn't fixed anything. That thought scared me more than the exhaustion creeping into my bones. One afternoon, I realized I hadn't sat down in hours. I'd been moving nonstop, cleaning up spills, breaking up arguments, answering questions, solving problems that weren't mine. When I finally collapsed onto the couch, my body felt heavy, like it had aged years in a single week. The house buzzed with noise, but no one noticed I'd stopped. She passed through the room, phone pressed to her ear, speaking in a low, excited voice. I caught fragments of the conversation. Dates, reservations, weather. When she saw me watching, she smiled quickly and kept walking. As if nothing about that should concern me. That was the first real flicker of unease. I started paying attention after that, noticing how she avoided specifics, how plans were always still being figured out, how she talked about needing rest like it was something she'd already scheduled. Meanwhile, my days filled up without anyone ever asking if I was tired. The kids started calling for me automatically. Not out of preference, out of habit. If someone got hurt, if someone was scared, if someone needed help, they looked for me. I'd catch her watching sometimes, expression unreadable, like she was confirming something to herself. At night, when the house finally went quiet, I lay awake replaying the day, trying to pinpoint when helping turned into being responsible. There was no single moment. No clean line. Just a slow transfer of weight, until my arms were shaking, and I didn't know how to set it down. I told myself it would reset after Christmas. That once the holiday passed, things would go back to normal. That this was just the chaos of the season. People get overwhelmed. People lean on each other. That's what family is. But deep down, a thought had started to form, small, sharp, impossible to ignore. What if this wasn't about Christmas at all? What if I wasn't here to be included, but to replace something they didn't want to carry anymore? The realization didn't fully land yet. It hovered at the edge of my mind, waiting. But even before I could name it, my body already knew. I was tired in a way sleep wouldn't fix. Alert in a way fear creates. Like someone bracing for impact without knowing when it's coming. And the scariest part was how normal it all had begun to feel. Because by the time I realized how much had been placed on me, I was already holding everything. I woke up to a silence that felt wrong immediately. Like my body knew before my mind caught up. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet that comes with early mornings or fresh snow. It was hollow, empty in a way that made my stomach drop before I even opened my eyes. For a few seconds, I stayed still, listening, waiting for the sounds that usually filled the house by now. A door creaking, a voice in the hallway, the clatter of dishes. Nothing answered back. I sat up slowly, the air in the room colder than it should have been. The bed across the hall was empty. Too neatly made. That was the first sign. She never made it that tight unless she was leaving for a while. I stood there longer than I needed to, staring at the smooth blanket, my brain scrambling for excuses. Maybe she was downstairs. Maybe she went out early. Maybe this was normal. But my chest already felt tight. I walked into the hallway, my steps cautious, almost quiet on purpose, like I was afraid of confirming what I already suspected. The bathroom door was open, lights off, no steam on the mirror. Her room was empty too. Closet door slightly ajar, hangers spaced too evenly. The suitcase I'd seen leaning against the wall the night before was gone. That's when my heart started pounding. I went downstairs 2 steps at a time, calling her name once, then again louder. The sound echoed back at me, flat and unanswered. The living room looked staged, like someone had reset it before leaving. Pillows arranged. Blankets folded. The Christmas tree still lit, cheerful and cruel. The kitchen was spotless, too spotless. The trash was taken out. The counter wiped down. A house prepared to be left behind. I checked the front door. Locked. The spare key still hanging on its hook. For a moment, I just stood there, hands on the doorknob, staring at nothing. Then I heard it. A small voice upstairs. Confused. Calling out. My phone buzzed in my pocket like it had been waiting for the exact second I'd finally let myself feel afraid. I pulled it out with shaking hands, already knowing who it was from. The message was short. Casual. Almost friendly. We're on the road. Don't worry. Everything's set up. Just keep them on their routine. On the road. I reread it again and again, my brain refusing to absorb the words in the order they were written. On the road to where? For how long? With who? My fingers hovered over the screen, typing and deleting, until I finally hit call. Straight to voicemail. That's when the crying started upstairs. Not whining. Not fussing. Real fear. The kind that cuts straight through you because it doesn't belong to you, but somehow it's now yours to answer. I didn't even grab a sweater. I just moved. My body already knew what to do even though my mind was screaming that this couldn't be happening. I found them standing in the hallway, rubbing their eyes, looking past me like they expected someone else to appear. Where did they go? One of them asked, voice cracking halfway through the sentence. I opened my mouth and nothing came out. How do you explain abandonment to a child when you're still processing it yourself? I knelt down and pulled them into my arms, feeling their small bodies shake against mine. I lied gently. I said they'd be back soon. I said everything was okay. I said it because I had to. Because the alternative was terrifying. Because someone had to sound steady even if it wasn't true. Inside, I was unraveling. As the morning dragged on, The reality settled in like a weight I couldn't shift. There was no itinerary left behind. No emergency contact written down. No timeline, just instructions disguised as reassurance. Food labeled in the fridge. Clothes laid out by day. Notes taped inside cabinets like reminders for someone who planned to be gone long enough to forget. This wasn't spontaneous. This was prepared. I felt foolish for not seeing it sooner. For ignoring the signs. For believing warmth meant safety. For mistaking attention for care. The house no longer felt like a place I was visiting. It felt like a responsibility that had been dropped on me without consent. The kids followed me everywhere now. Bathroom, kitchen, living room. They stayed close, eyes constantly searching my face, as if checking whether I was still there. Every time my phone buzzed with a notification that wasn't from her, my heart sank a little more. I tried calling again, and again. Nothing. The hours stretched unbearably long. Breakfast passed. Then lunch. I moved through the day mechanically, making meals, cleaning messes, answering questions with half-truths and practiced calm. But underneath it all, panic simmered. What if something happened? What if I needed help? What if she didn't come back when she said she would? What if she never planned to? By late afternoon, exhaustion hit me like a wall. Not physical, emotional. The kind that makes your thoughts blur and your patience fray. I locked myself in the bathroom for 30 seconds just to breathe, hands braced on the sink, staring at my own reflection like I didn't recognize the person looking back. My eyes looked older. Harder. Like something had shifted permanently. When I stepped back out, one of the kids was sitting on the floor, waiting. "I thought you left too," they said quietly. That sentence broke something in me. I realized then that whatever anger I felt, whatever fear, whatever betrayal, it couldn't come out. Not here. Not now. These kids didn't choose this. They were just as abandoned as I was, even if they didn't have the words for it yet, so I swallowed it. I made dinner. I read stories. I tucked them into bed, answering the same question over and over with the same gentle lie. When the house finally went quiet, I sat alone in the living room. Lights off except for the tree, my phone heavy in my hand. Still no response. That was the moment the truth finally landed, heavy and undeniable. They didn't forget to tell me. They didn't assume I knew. They left knowing I'd stay. And sitting there in that silent house, surrounded by responsibility I never agreed to, I understood something that changed me forever. I wasn't a guest anymore. I was the plan. The days after that stopped feeling like days at all. They blurred into one long stretch of time measured not by hours, but by needs. Who was hungry? Who was tired? Who was scared? Who needed reassurance? I stopped checking the calendar because it didn't mean anything anymore. Morning came whether I was ready or not, and night fell no matter how much I begged my body to stay alert. I learned quickly that fear doesn't always feel loud. Sometimes it feels methodical, efficient. I woke up each day already running through mental checklists before my feet touched the floor. Breakfast, meds, schoolwork, laundry, baths, stories, bed, repeat. Survival doesn't leave much room for emotion, and maybe that's why I survived it all. The house became smaller as the days went on. Not physically, but emotionally. Every room held responsibility. Every corner had eyes watching me, waiting for cues on how scared they were allowed to be. I couldn't afford to fall apart, because if I did, everything would collapse with me. So I became steady. Even when my hands shook, even when my chest felt tight, I spoke softly and smiled at the right moments. At night after I tucked them in, I sat alone in the kitchen with the lights off, listening for sounds that might mean trouble. The creak of the stairs. A cough. A whimper. I slept in short bursts, never fully resting, my body permanently braced for interruption. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined worst-case scenarios. emergencies, accidents, questions I couldn't answer. And always, in the background, the same unanswered question echoed. How long? I tried calling again the second day. Then the third. My messages shifted in tone, even though I tried to keep them calm. I asked for clarity, for a return date, for acknowledgement. Sometimes hours would pass before I'd get a reply, and when I did, it was vague. Dismissive, soon. Don't stress. You've got this? As if confidence could replace consent. I stopped asking after that. Food ran lower than I expected. I learned how to stretch meals, how to make snacks out of whatever was left, how to hide my own hunger so the kids wouldn't notice. I caught myself eating standing up, taking quick bites between tasks like fuel instead of food. I forgot what it felt like to sit down and eat without watching the clock. The kids changed too. At first, they were restless, asking questions constantly. Then they grew quiet. Observant. They watched me the way people watch someone steering a boat through rough water, alert, anxious, hoping I knew where I was going. They clung to me more, followed me from room to room, asked permission for things they never used to ask permission for. It was like they'd recalibrated their sense of safety around my presence. That terrified me. I didn't want to be the center of their world. I didn't want to replace anyone. I just wanted help. But help never came. And the longer it didn't, the clearer it became that this wasn't temporary chaos. It was endurance. There was a moment, one afternoon, when one of them spilled juice across the floor and froze, eyes wide, breath caught, waiting for anger. That moment shattered me. I dropped to my knees, grabbed towels, laughed too loudly, told them it was okay, that accidents happen. But inside, something twisted painfully. They weren't afraid of the mess. They were afraid of losing me too. That's when the isolation really hit. Not just physical isolation, emotional isolation. There was no adult conversation, no one to say, "This isn't fair." No one to tell me I was allowed to be overwhelmed. I couldn't vent. I couldn't break. I carried everything quietly. Because if I didn't, who would? The nights were the hardest. When the house was dark and still, my thoughts finally caught up to me. I replayed every conversation that led up to this. Every moment I could have said no. Every red flag I brushed aside because I wanted to believe in good intentions. I wondered how someone could leave their children behind without hesitation, trusting someone else to shoulder the weight without question. And I wondered what that said about how they saw me. Somewhere in the middle of one sleepless night, it hit me. This wasn't just about convenience. This was about control. About knowing I wouldn't leave. About knowing I'd stay silent and handle it, because that's what I'd always done. I wasn't chosen because I was loved. I was chosen because I was reliable. That realization hurt more than the exhaustion. I started documenting things quietly, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Dates, messages. What I was responsible for. What I wasn't told. Something in me knew this would matter later, even if I didn't yet know how. It felt like building a lifeline while treading water. Slow, careful, desperate. The kids asked less about when they'd come back. Instead, they asked things like, "Will you be here tomorrow?" And, "Can you stay until I fall asleep?" I always said yes, even when my chest tightened at the implication. I stayed longer. Sat on the floor until their breathing evened out. Waited until I was sure they were really asleep. I didn't cry in front of them. Not once. But sometimes, in the bathroom with the fan on, I let tears fall silently, gripping the sink, willing myself to hold it together for just one more day. Just one more night. Just until someone showed up. But no one did. And somewhere between surviving breakfast on day 4 and bedtime on day 5, I realized something that scared me more than being abandoned. I was adapting. I was functioning in a situation that should never have been mine to manage. I was becoming competent in a role I never consented to. And the longer this went on, the easier it would be for them to pretend this was normal. That thought lit something inside me. Not panic, not anger, but clarity. This wasn't just about getting through it anymore. It was about what it meant if I did. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It didn't crash into me or knock the air from my lungs. It seeped in slowly, the way cold does when you've been outside too long and didn't notice because you were busy moving. It came in pieces, scattered across ordinary moments, until suddenly I couldn't ignore it anymore. I was standing at the sink one morning, washing the same cup twice, because my mind was somewhere else, when it hit me that no one had checked on us. Not really. Days had passed, and there hadn't been a single message asking how the kids were doing. No questions about sleep, schoolwork, moods, or meals. The messages I did get were about logistics. Did you find the extra blankets? The trash goes out Thursday. They like that show before bed. Instructions. Not concern. That's when something inside me shifted. If this were temporary, wouldn't there be urgency? If this were accidental, wouldn't there be apologies? If this were love, wouldn't there be care? Instead, there was comfort. Their comfort. The kind that comes from knowing someone else is handling what you didn't want to deal with. I watched the kids eat breakfast that morning, laughing quietly over something silly, and my chest tightened with a mix of protectiveness and dread. They were adapting too, settling into a version of life where I was the constant, where absence was normal. And I realized, with a clarity that made my hands tremble, that the longer this continued, the more damage it would do, not just to me, but to them. That's when I stopped asking when they'd be back and started asking why they felt allowed to leave. I replayed every conversation leading up to this time without the softness I'd wrapped them in before. The praise. You're so good at this. The way she framed exhaustion like a badge I should admire. The way she talked about needing a break, as if that automatically meant someone else would step in. She didn't see me as help. She saw me as a solution. And that distinction mattered more than anything. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Every message read differently. Every word carried intent I'd previously ignored. You're doing great. No longer sounded encouraging. It sounded reassuring, like someone making sure the system they put in place was still running smoothly. Thank you so much. Felt transactional, not grateful. I wasn't being appreciated. I was being relied on, and not in a mutual way. In a way that stripped me of choice. There was a moment that sealed it for me. One of the kids asked if we could make a tradition. Something small, something harmless. A routine that assumed permanence. They said it casually, without realizing what they were asking, and I felt my throat close. I smiled and said maybe, but inside, alarms were blaring. Because children don't ask for permanence unless they feel instability. And suddenly I understood that my silence wasn't protecting them. It was enabling what hurt them. That realization came with guilt so heavy it made me nauseous. I had been so focused on surviving, on keeping things calm, that I hadn't questioned the long-term cost. I hadn't asked myself what message this situation was sending. What lesson it was teaching about responsibility, about boundaries, about who is allowed to disappear and who is expected to stay. I saw myself through her eyes then. Not as someone she missed, not as someone she valued emotionally, but as someone predictable. Someone who wouldn't walk away. Someone who would absorb inconvenience without protest. That hurt more than the abandonment itself, because abandonment can be chaotic. This was calculated. I realized then that if I kept going like this, there would be no dramatic end, no apology, no reckoning. there would just be more assumptions, longer absences, more weight placed on me until I no longer remembered what it felt like to put it down. I thought about the future for the first time, not the next meal or bedtime, but weeks from now, months, years. I imagined holidays repeating this pattern, emergencies becoming expectations, my role quietly solidifying without ever being named. And I knew, with a certainty that made my chest burn, that this was the moment everything depended on, not when they came back. Now, the power I had left wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it existed. It lived in truth, in visibility. In refusing to keep this hidden, I started speaking differently, calmly, clearly. I asked direct questions and waited for answers. I stated what I was responsible for, and what I wasn't. I stopped cushioning my words to protect feelings that hadn't protected me. I documented everything, not with anger, but with precision. Because precision is what survives gaslighting, and for the first time I felt something stronger than fear. Resolve. I wasn't going to explode. I wasn't going to disappear. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to stand exactly where I was, and let the truth exist without softening it. Because realization isn't just about seeing what's happening. It's about deciding what happens next. And in that quiet house, surrounded by the consequences of someone else's choices, I made one of my own. I would not carry this alone anymore, no matter what it cost. The truth didn't come out in a dramatic explosion. It slipped into the world the way secrets always do when they've grown too heavy to carry. Through exhaustion, through honesty that no longer has the energy to stay quiet. I didn't sit down and make a grand announcement. I didn't call a meeting or write a long message explaining myself. I simply stopped covering for them. The first crack happened almost accidentally. A neighbor asked how long they'd been gone, casual and friendly, like it was common knowledge. I opened my mouth to give the usual vague answer. Just a few days. And nothing came out. My throat closed around the lie. The pause stretched long enough to feel uncomfortable. And instead of filling it with excuses, I said the truth. I don't know. The words felt dangerous as soon as they left my mouth. Exposed. Final. The neighbor's expression changed instantly, concern replacing politeness. They asked a few more questions, gently at first, then with growing urgency. Who was with the kids? Did anyone know where they were? Had they left contact information? I answered honestly. And for the first time, I watched the situation through someone else's eyes. It didn't look manageable. It didn't look generous. It didn't look normal. It looked alarming. That conversation stayed with me long after it ended. It gave me permission I didn't know I needed. Permission to see this as wrong without immediately defending it. Permission to stop shrinking it down so it wouldn't scare anyone. More people started to notice after that. Teachers asking questions about pick-up plans. A family friend calling to check in. Even casual conversations began to shift, the way they do when something is off and everyone can feel it, but no one wants to be the first to say it. I stopped redirecting. I stopped minimizing. I stopped pretending this was temporary. Every time I answered honestly, the silence on the other end of the conversation grew heavier. People asked if I needed help, asked if this was okay, asked if someone should step in, and each time I felt both relief and fear. Relief because I wasn't alone in seeing it anymore. Fear because once something is seen, it can't be unseen. The message finally came later that night, longer than the others. Sharper, defensive. Full of explanations that felt rehearsed, like they'd been waiting for this moment. She accused me of overreacting, of embarrassing her, of making things seem worse than they were. You didn't have to tell people, she wrote. That sentence burned. As if the truth was the problem. As if silence was the agreement I'd broken. I read the message 3 times before responding. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew exactly what not to say anymore. I didn't apologize. I didn't soften it. I didn't reassure her that everything was fine. I told her people asked questions. I told her I answered honestly. I told her this situation required transparency. Her response was immediate. Anger, justification, blame. She said I was trying to make her look bad. That I was twisting things. That I knew she needed this break and should have been more supportive. She reminded me of everything she'd done for me. Every favor, every sacrifice, stacking them like a debt I'd just defaulted on. And in the middle of it all, one sentence stood out, sharp and revealing. That's when it clicked. Trust, to her, meant silence. Trust meant endurance. Trust meant carrying what she didn't want to. I realized then that exposure wasn't betrayal. It was boundary. The kids felt the shift too. Adults spoke in quieter voices around them now. Conversations stopped when they entered rooms. There was a tension in the air, not frightening, but noticeable. Like something fragile had finally been acknowledged. One of them asked if they were in trouble. That question broke my heart. I knelt down, looked them in the eye, and said no. I told them none of this was their fault. I told them adults make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes take time to fix. I didn't lie. I didn't over-explain. I just stayed present. Behind the scenes, things started moving. Calls were made. Plans were discussed. People who had assumed everything was fine now understood it wasn't. And once they understood, they couldn't unlearn it. She came back angry. Not relieved. Not apologetic. Angry. She walked into the house like someone returning to a crime scene, eyes scanning for damage. The first thing she did wasn't hug the kids. It was look at me. Like I was the variable she hadn't accounted for. We didn't argue right away. The kids were there. So we moved around each other stiffly, pretending everything was normal, while the air buzzed with everything unsaid. But later, when the house was quiet again, she confronted me. She asked why I'd told people. Why I couldn't just handle it. Why I had to make it a thing. And for the first time I didn't flinch. I told her I didn't agree to this. I told her I was scared. I told her the kids were scared. She scoffed at that last part. They're fine, she said. That was it. That was the moment I understood there would be no accountability unless it was forced by reality itself. No apology unless it was demanded by consequence. No recognition of harm unless it came from outside her narrative. And suddenly, the guilt I'd been carrying lifted, because exposure wasn't about punishment, it was about protection. For the kids. For myself. For the truth. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just stood there steady, letting the weight of what had been revealed settle where it belonged. She could be angry. She could deny. She could rewrite it later if she wanted. But she couldn't put it back in the dark. And that changed everything. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded slowly, unevenly. The way truth does when it's finally out in the open, and everyone has to decide what to do with it. There was no dramatic reckoning, no single moment where everything was resolved. Instead, there were shifts. Subtle at first, then undeniable. The house felt different the moment she came back. Not louder, not quieter, just heavier. Like the walls had absorbed everything that had happened, and were holding on to it. The kids stayed close to me at first, watching her carefully, measuring her mood before moving freely. That alone spoke volumes. Children don't change their behavior without a reason. She noticed it too. She tried to brush it off, laughing a little too loudly, overcompensating with affection that felt performative. Extra hugs. Over the top reassurance. Grand gestures meant to erase absence instead of acknowledge it. But something had shifted beneath the surface, and no amount of pretending could smooth it over. People didn't forget what they'd learned. That was the real consequence. Conversations didn't reset the way she expected them to. Questions lingered. Boundaries appeared where there hadn't been any before. Offers of help were directed around her, not through her. I watched as control slowly slipped from her hands, replaced by accountability she hadn't planned for. And for the first time, I wasn't the one absorbing the discomfort. She tried, at first, to return things to normal. To slip back into old patterns. To speak to me like nothing had happened, like I'd simply filled in for a bit, and now things could go back to the way they were. But I wasn't the same person who had walked into that house for Christmas. I didn't rush to help. I didn't anticipate needs. I didn't silently step in. When she assumed, I corrected her. When she deflected, I stayed quiet. When she minimized, I held the line. It wasn't loud resistance. It was steady. And it unsettled her more than anger ever could. The kids began to relax slowly, cautiously, like animals testing whether it was safe to trust again. They laughed more, slept deeper, asked fewer questions about where people were going and when they'd be back. That told me everything I needed to know about the cost of what had happened. And the necessity of preventing it from happening again. The aftermath followed me too. I didn't leave untouched. There were moments, days later, when exhaustion hit me out of nowhere, sharp and disorienting. Sounds startled me. Silence made my chest tighten. I caught myself listening for footsteps that weren't coming, bracing for responsibility that no longer belonged to me. Survival mode doesn't shut off just because the crisis ends. But alongside the fatigue, something else grew. Clarity. I saw the relationship for what it was. Not just this incident, but the pattern beneath it. How often I'd been relied on without being considered. How often my strength had been mistaken for consent. How silence had been interpreted as agreement. That realization didn't make me bitter. It made me honest. I stopped explaining myself to people who benefited from misunderstanding me. I stopped offering access to parts of me that had been treated like tools. I stopped confusing endurance with love. She didn't like that. There were moments of tension. Passive comments. Attempts to guilt me back into old roles, but they didn't land the way they used to. Once you see a pattern clearly, it loses its power. The biggest consequence, though, was internal. I trusted myself again. I trusted the part of me that felt uneasy long before things went wrong. I trusted the instincts I'd been taught to ignore in favor of keeping the peace. I trusted that speaking up didn't make me difficult. It made me responsible. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to justify my boundaries. I didn't need permission to step back. I didn't need validation to know what I experienced was real. And that changed how I moved through the world. I left that house knowing I could survive abandonment, but also knowing I no longer had to tolerate it. Knowing I could care deeply without disappearing. Knowing that love doesn't ask you to carry everything alone and call it loyalty. The kids waved goodbye when I left, and this time, there was no fear in their eyes. Just warmth, stability, the kind that comes from knowing adults are being watched and held to account. As I drove away, the Christmas lights still glowing faintly behind me, I felt something close to peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because something fundamental had been corrected. I had told the truth. I had stayed. And then, when it was time, I had chosen myself. That Christmas didn't give me the family moment I'd hoped for. It gave me something better. A line I would never let anyone cross again.